Well, welcome everybody to ASA's fabulous Travel Tuesday series of lectures. And I think this evening we're in for a real treat with Gillian Hovell as our speaker, talking on Orkney and Shetland, 5,000 Years of Wonder. Gillian is a specialist in ancient history and also in archaeology. She's worked for the BBC TV as a specialist again in archaeology and in prehistory. And she has over the years been involved in major digs. Gillian is also an author, and her book sounds really fascinating. Visiting the Past, a guide to finding and understanding Britain's archaeology. Now, Gillian has some fabulous tours coming up. Her tour, Shetland and Orkney, Archaeology and Wildlife of the Northern Isles. I have heard from some people who have done this tour, they all rave about it. I must admit to feeling very envious. It's a part of the world I have yet to visit, and it's very high on my list. So I'm sure you will join me in welcoming Gillian to learn about this truly fascinating and very spectacular part of the world. Over to you, Gillian. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, and good evening to you all. Well, this is where we're heading to, Shetland and Orkney, way off the top of Britain. And as you go up through Britain, you leave behind where the Roman Empire reached. So as you go up through England, through Britain, you get to Scotland and you leave behind the Roman Empire. By the time you're in Edinburgh, you're past where the Romans were, apart from some campaigns, and then you're heading off. And as you can see, Orkney Islands are not far off for Scotland, but Shetland is a long way. And there are definite Viking links, as we shall see, and you can understand why when you look at this map. On the way up through Britain, as I say, you leave the Roman Empire behind and you enter the Pictish world. And the Pictish world is one where there is no literacy, apart from a few signs, Ogham script it's called. And the very first signs, that these Pictish stones which have symbols on them, and we don't know what they mean, these snakes and the double discs and a mirror at the bottom there and a Z sign, they are a cultural sign that meant something to them. They appear all over. They appear up in Orkney as well. And as time goes on, Christianity will come in and they will maintain some of their symbols on the back of their slabs, but they'll put crosses on the front. And you can see several of them within just a few miles. It's a wonderful trip through time in itself, but it's nothing compared with the time scale that you'll have when you do Orkney. And when you get to Orkney and Shetland, they say that if you scratch the surface of Orkney, it bleeds archaeology. It literally is just under the surface and it is everywhere. So a trip to Orkney or Shetland takes you right from the north to the south, the east and the west of both these sets of islands. And you can see that Orkney is a massive island, 70 islands in total, although some of them are just like lumps of rock. 20 of them or so are inhabited, sometimes by only about 60 people, but the larger ones are inhabited. Now, this is the kind of scenery that you get. These rock cliffs laid down in slabs, and that's important. Not only does it get the geologists buzzing because there's some of the oldest rocks on the planet actually showing on the surface in Shetland, but also the birds are there because they like cliff tops, but also it shaped the history and the prehistory of Orkney and Shetland. Because at many sites, this is what's down on the beach. You get these slabs and you can see that it's laid in layers like this. And you can pop down to the beach and pick up a flattish piece of stone and just take it back to build with. So you already have flat slabs. You don't have to go quarrying it. Now, in the Neolithic, we know they had trees, but they overused them. And the trees became sparser and sparser. And there is a wind straight from the Atlantic. It has the Gulf Stream, so it's not that cold. They don't get really cold winters. It's better than Yorkshire in that sense. And they have, the winds come in and you have to build your houses of something, because the trees, if you grow a sapling in a bare environment, it just doesn't grow. It just gets stunted and gets blown sideways. So timber has to be taken from driftwood, which means that even in the Pictish era, and bear in mind the Neolithic is 3000 BC, it's 5,000 years ago, and that's where our story chronologically will start. Here in Yarsov, some of the biggest buildings are Pictish, like those stones we saw. And you can see that they're using stones, flattish, laid one another without any mortar. And that's how they've been building since 5,000 years before. So this is over 3,000 years of building structure taken from the beaches. It shapes the way the archaeology is. And because they built in stone and not timber, the Neolithic, we have lots of archaeology. So in the Pictish times, it looks pretty similar to how the Neolithic would look, except it's just slightly different designs. You can see there's no mortar, there's little stones wedged in. Some of the ones on your right of your screen, you can see the big slabs and then a little stone wedged in to make sure that the stone leans away and doesn't fall inwards to the building. Low doorways, that's a structural reason, we think, as much as defensive. But you can build up and make chambers. This is in the Pictish houses. It's quite cozy, but no windows. The roof has fallen in, but in these cells where you'd sleep and you'd store things, the roof goes up and the stones get nearer and nearer and nearer and nearer, corbelling up, and so that you have these lovely cells, as they're called. Nice flat stones at the bottom, which are good for leaning against, actually, if you're sitting on the floor. And imagine this full of organic materials, full of your food, full of your cloths, full of furs, full of all sorts of things, and you have a home. And these Pictish ones are just into the AD era. And as I say, the technology, the resources for building are just the same, enabling us to imagine a bit more when we go back to the Neolithic. And we can go back. We could go back to 3,600 BC. You're looking at Papa Westre's Nap of Howard site. It is the oldest upstanding house in Northern Europe. And you know, you can walk through a field just with cows in, there's no guardian to the site, and you can walk in through that doorway. You can walk into someone's home from over 5,500 years ago. It's quite a hairs at the back of the neck kind of feeling. It's beautiful scenery as well. Now, these houses were set into rubbish middens. So there was an old rubbish midden and they dug down into it because the walls then packed up against the side of this dry compost. Midden is an archaeological term for the compost rubbish tip. Doesn't smell, it's just long since lost that, but it's windproof, it's supportive, and you can build your one layer of stone nicely up against it. And you can see it's not quite circular, it's sort of slightly figure of eight with sections in it, niches, a little crawlway from one room to the other. One's a workshop, we think, one's a living area. We don't really know, to be sure. That's a bit of a theme. We just have to take the clues. Archaeologists do that, and theories are always changing. But this is over 5,000 years old, and it's such a privilege to walk in through that doorway. And if you're thinking, oh, they were primitive back then, well, think again. They're just like us. You take a newborn baby from now and a newborn baby from then. Don't worry about the ethics. This is just a thought experiment. If you move them at the second of birth, both would grow up perfectly happily. In fact, the Neolithic one could even have grown up to be Einstein. They're just as clever as we are. It's just that they have no metal and they have stones in Orkney and Shetland to build with. But look at that doorway, beautifully paved floor. The doorway itself has been designed carefully with nice slabs. There is a space where you can put bolts across so you can shut it. It is designed. It is a home. This one, though, in Shetland, is far from the beach. And you can see that the stones are big and rough and field boundary stones, really. And it's called Stenidale Temple. And we don't know what it's for. It's not a home. Had two big pillars in the middle. You can see the post holes. And where would they have got that from? Well, probably driftwood, but it's a long way from the shore. You're right up in the hills. They may be islands, these places, but they have a wonderful change of flora, fauna as you go through the islands. So up there in the hills, you have the bog grass. It's a very much a hilly kind of environment. And this is almost as far from the sea as you can get on the islands. But the sea is everywhere. And the views are fantastic. The beaches are lovely when you get to them. And you can imagine the Vikings coming in on here. You have to imagine the Neolithics coming from the first time, the first farmers. That's who the Neolithics are. The people who arrived and first settled down and farmed and lived in one place permanently as opposed to being nomadic. Having said that, we have to hop from island to island. and very pleasant it is too on a variety of ferries. Gorgeous it is. But Orkney was only a couple of islands in the Neolithic. The sea level was much lower, so what we see are what would have been hilltops in the Neolithic. So everything we see is that's prominent and high up, and they could have walked from one island, hilltop, to the other. So much of the archaeology is under the water, but there's so much on land, we've got lifetimes of work to do just to sort that out. And as you head out to Rousey Island, it's an island which is full of tombs. Now, tombs are stone built, so they last, and this little neat one on Rousey is unique. It's 2 stories. You go into an upper chamber, which had some cremation remains, and you go down a ladder. And you go down there, you can see how those stones have got those uprights, just like the house did in Papawestre. And you've got the dry stone walls, and then we go down. And it was built like this, 2 stories deliberately. And when you get down there, it's a tiny little chamber with benches. It's one of the few that still has the benches intact, because sometimes we think they might not have been stone, it might have been wood in some cases. And there were burials found here, crouched skeletons, people curled up. Not many, just a couple. And that begs the question, where is everybody? These tombs aren't full of hundreds of people. Is it the original ancestors of where they settled down for the first time, which is true in some parts of England, we think, now we're doing DNA. And yeah, we can date bones much easier. But is it that it's the last people to die? And to put it bluntly, you put your body there until it's a skeleton, and then you remove the bones, and we don't know. Put them on your dresser, like having Granny in an urn, the ashes on mantelpiece. Does something else happen to them? We don't know where everybody is, but they build these impressive tombs, and they're important. And it's the atmosphere in this is just wonderful. It's quiet because it's under the ground. Then on the same island, not far away, this massive one, the biggest tomb that they have. It's called stalled. It's a stalled cairn, cairn being a pile of stones, constructed pile of stones, and it has stalls, as if you could have cattle in each of the stalls. And imagine there were benches between these. And they found the grand total of 25 people in here, which is a lot for the Neolithic. But something this size, it's cathedral size, it's just immense. And these were very early, just like Papawestre House had uprights separating the rooms. So is this a house of the dead? Or now they're saying, they built their tombs in stone, and then when they had to build the houses, they copied the tombs because they had the construction. That's actually an active debate in archaeology. Now there's 2 types of tombs. There are the stalled cairns, long and thin, with the uprights, and there are chambered tombs, where you crouch low and you go in through a long channel, and then you go into a rounded chamber, which might have other chambers off of it, little ones. So when you get in, this one is bizarrely a hybrid. It's stalled, it's got the uprights, with a nice little room at the end with a sloping stone. They always seem to have this pattern, means something, we don't know what. But it also has a chamber coming off of it. And in there would be a little corbelled roof, a bit like that later picture building we saw, but much smaller, where bones are found. So there are designs to this over hundreds of years. And at this one that you've just seen the picture of, it's Unston Cairn. Little rounded mound. There's the entranceway there, and it's given the name to the pottery, Unston pottery. Round bottomed bowls with a zigzaggy type shape at the top, and this is the early pottery. And lots of it was found here, which is why it's called Unston ware. It was then superseded by grooved ware, which came in while this was still being used. They overlapped a little while, but grooved ware continued on. And grooved ware continued on to one of the most magnificent times of the Neolithic. But Unston ware, and you can see it's not exactly great pottery. Look at that broken piece, the curve coming down from the rim. It's a bit like a digestive biscuit in there, really. It's not fine ware, but it works. Some of the tombs are tiny. You can get about 2 or 3 people in them. This is Cwyn Cairn, and it's a round chamber with 3-4 chambers off of it, which you have to really duck down and crawl into. And it's cute. Everybody seems to like it. You get in and you're shielded from the outside world. But when you do come out, this is the view you see. These are built not on hilltops, because if you have a hill and then you build a mound, it just looks like the top of the hill. So you build it on the slope and it stands out then. And you can imagine, yes, some of this would have been dry land in front of you, but if you were coming from the sea, you would see these tombs. And there's not quite a row, but they're scattered along these hillsides. Does that mean each village had its own tomb? Does it mean each family had its own tomb? Why are there so many of them scattered along with so few people in each? But we're very glad that they did build them all, because they have survived the test of time. And the biggest of all is Maes Howe. And it's massive. It's like a cathedral size, built about 2500 BC, we think. We don't really know, because it was robbed out. The Vikings had got in, they left runic script on it, they put graffiti on it, and later on it was excavated, and there was nothing but the graffiti there, really. But it stands in a very prominent place in Orkney. It stands in the heart of the Neolithic, the UNESCO World Heritage Site, which includes several sites. Maes Howe is one of them, this big burial tomb. We stand on this spit of land called the Ness of Brodgar, and we look out towards the island of Hoy with the 2 mountains, which has its own little microclimate, because it's the only mountainous place in Orkney. And we have a lock on one side and a lock on the other of this spit of ground, and we have stone circles. We have the ring of Brodgar, beautiful ring of Brodgar. Well, there were possibly 70 stones originally, and they've find that they are only 1 foot down into the rock. They are actually cut into the rock. A slot has been made, and they've been slotted in, but only about that much. Scary. It's amazing any of them have survived. In living memory, one was hit by lightning while a chap was walking his dog past it, and it just bang. So nature sometimes destroys them. They've been quarried from at least 7 quarries from all around the islands. So did each community get told, bring your own stone? Did they say, bring them in, bring them in? I always imagine them sort of blowing the equivalent of a whistle and saying, come, come, bring your stone, who's got the biggest stone, etc. But we now find that there's a lack of permanence to this. We see it as a finished object. But sometimes we think they were put in at different times, over generations. This is a dynamic monument, not a permanent one. It just happens to have, when it was stopped being added to, stayed as it was. They built a ditch around the edge into the rock using no metal, just antler picks and ox shoulder blades as shovels. Phenomenal work, absolutely amazing. And we don't know what they did there, but it was important and it brought people together. And just down the road there, you see the island of Hoy in the background, and you're looking out across there, and you've got the stones of Steness. Now, while the ring of Brodgar was about 2500 BC, this is 500 years earlier, at least 3000 BC. There's only a few stones left, but these were set deeper into the ground. And there's only a few left. I guess over time they've fallen. In 1814, a tenant farmer started destroying them, much to the locals' anger. And yet you have a ditch around it. Not deep, though. That's been ploughed out. And it has a hearth in the middle that was taken from a little settlement just behind it and replaced there. These stone monuments are dynamic, living, used differently for each generation, updated, if you like. They're not just put them there and leave them there forever. But they point up to the sky. We're not quite sure why, but it was important. But again, these stones have been taken from the beach. This is the same as those little stones used for building, but you can lift big pieces as well. Now, the Ness of Brodgar is between these standing circles. It was found in 2003. It's an honour to have been alive when it was found. It's a bit like how it must have felt when Skara Brae was found in 1850, the village houses, which we'll look at in a bit. But this has changed our view of the Neolithic forever. It's complex. This is not a little hut to live in. This is ceremonial. This is adapted over time. It's not built on solid foundations. They've subsided. They didn't seem to care about that. They just sort of moved things out of the way and rebuilt. And yet they faced these walls. Look at that back wall, and it's beautifully faced. They've chosen the slabs carefully. There's a hearth in the middle. Many, many buildings in this area. And on this one, you can see that same one. They're standing in the hearth. Look at that paving on the outside. Look at the wall. It's beautifully laid. And there are buildings which interact with other buildings. This is the latest one, the one in front of us. And it's been wonderful. This is the last year. Sadly, 2024 is when they will close down the site. I have dug here a couple of years, and what an honour it is to be the first person to pick up a piece of pot that's 5,000 years and hasn't seen the light of day for 5,000 years. A real honour. What's found in it, though, may not be settlement, are ceremonial items, carved stone balls. We don't know what they're for. They fit in the hand. You do this with them. You turn them around. You can see 4 facets, 2 facets, 3 facets. No wear and tear, no analysis on it to give us a clue. Mace heads, which have never been used, but are finely decorated and placed very carefully in these buildings, which had stone roofs, we know. This particular Neolithic, lozenges and zigzags, which is very Neolithic art, never a picture, just these geometric shapes. But this stone had had its decoration put inwards to the wall so that you couldn't see it. Was that because this is obsolete, or because it was something that was a prayer for the gods only to see? We can only guess. And the butterfly shape that they talk about from this site, lots of them. I do wonder, I look at it and at first glance I sometimes see the double-headed axes of the Minoans, but they don't seem to be drawn in that way. So what is this butterfly shape that's going on? I mentioned Skara Brae. The people who lived here, just up the coast from this UNESCO site, Heart of Neolithic, would have walked down to the Ring of Brodgar, Standing Stones, to the Ness of Brodgar, to Maes Howe. They may even have built some of these. They lived here. This place was exposed in a storm in the 1850s. And these houses, built into middens, some of them freestanding, but you have a bed on either side, you have a hearth, you have a dresser at the back, always, or is it an altar? There's another debate that's going on. Grinding stones, pots for keeping water intact in there. Were you keeping food in there, or is it just your water? It wouldn't have held much. So they're using skins to hold water as well. They would have organic materials, and they really do feel like home. Excavated in the 1920s by your very own Gordon Childs, who is an Australian archaeologist. He often has his little bow tie that he had always tie as painted in red on a black and white, because he was very keen that this showed everybody lived egalitarian lives. There was no house bigger than anybody else's house. This is our natural state. Well, actually, we've only excavated a fraction of the village. There's more in the fields behind. So he could be very wrong there. And human nature, I'm afraid, does tend to make leaders rather. I love the 2 women here, the flappers of the 1920s. Actually, they were involved in the dig. They aren't just, picturesque bystanders. So it's all fantastic to go there and remember how this was excavated. Between the houses are winding pathways to block out the wind that comes off the sea. And as part of our tours, sometimes very few people get to walk down in amongst the houses. We get access. ASA gets access. I know the people have got us access. They have several after closing hours access, and we managed to snaffle one of those up. You can't have everyone going through, thousands and thousands of people. The cruise ships come in for this, so it would just destroy the place. And in fact, you walk around the top of the houses, and that is beginning to compress the houses as well. So get to Orkney while you can, still walk around very closely on top of the houses, because I think another 10 years and they won't be able to allow you to do that. It will do too much damage. So seize the moment. Come and walk, crouch down There's a question. What do you do if you're 8 months pregnant is what I want to know. How do you crouch into these places? They had art. We saw that in Nessa Brodka. Bone decorations, grooved ware with these shapes on it, using bone as sort of scapulars and gouges and pins and awls and Morse-shaped stones, strange three-pronged thing that nobody knows what it's for. You use bone, you use stone, you use antlers. That's what you use without metal. And that's what makes them different to us, the resources and the technology. Nothing else is different. They're just like us, as I've said. They would scavenge bird eggs. And there's a lot of birds in Orkney and Shetland. One of the joys of going there, this beautiful fulmar just flew past me. And you would go down the cliffs. Imagine climbing down the cliffs to get your eggs. And the bird life is fantastic. And it would have been no less so, in fact, more so in the Neolithic. So plenty of eggs, plenty of birds. And I do wonder, did they ooh over the puffins just as we do? You cannot walk past a puffin and not stop and gaze at it, I promise you. I imagine they did just the same. The seals, obviously coming off the sea, they're a good source of resources as well for the Neolithic. They're farmers. They would have used anything that comes up. As you go forward in time in Orkney and Shetland, you get to the Iron Age. You get to the Bronze Age, but there's not a lot of that. It seems to skip largely to the Iron Age, the archaeology, and these huge towers. Thick walls with little houses around them called brochs. This is big windowless towers. This is the Broch of Gurness, one of the most famous. And inside the walls, they're so thick that they built staircases, an outer wall, an inner wall, and you would go up through and round on these stone staircases. So you had upper levels, which have long since eroded away. We go to a site called Old Scatness in Shetland, and you can see the hearth in the middle, the little cells, just like we saw at Jarlshof. But they've built a reconstruction, and that is part of archaeology. We reconstruct. We take what we see in the archaeology and faithfully reproduce it. And here they add all the organic materials, the baskets, the pottery, the fire, the smell of the peat, which had existed by the Iron Age. And peat is such a strong smell, a very aromatic smell, that you are transported back in time. Experimental archaeology, it's not just for the tourists, it's there to see how you would live, what you naturally do in these spaces. And the brochs did get big. And Musa Broch in Shetland is the most intact one anywhere in the world. That means Scotland is the only place that they had them. And here, as you can see, you can go up the staircase. And I'm not great with heights, but even I can go up that staircase and be happy at the top of it. And you get up, and it's not the top. As you can see, it's very eroded down. It's consolidated to make it safe. What are they? Are they defensive? Are they status? Because you can see one to another. Are they trade? That's a new idea that's coming in, something to do with the sort of signaling we are here. Are they all of them? Do they all have settlements around them or not? It's a mystery, but it's a privilege to go back 2,000 years, roughly, a bit before and a bit after, and actually walk into a broch and see how it feels. Well, down on the shores, which is where most of the brochs are, you have all the wonderful scenery of Orkney and Shetland. It's one of the things that draws me to it time and time again. And this is a unique feature, or not unique, but not uncommon in Shetland and Orkney. But the tides come in both ways, the currents, and they create a bank of sand called a tombolo, not a tombola, a tombolo. And this sand builds up and you can walk across it. So you get to the island on the causeway. And this happens to be St. Ninian's in Shetland. And there's an old ruined chapel where some Pictish treasure, silver treasure, was found. Everywhere you go, even if it looks like this, which looks quiet and deserted, people were living there at some point. The Vikings came in, and they stayed, and they ruled. The Scandinavian king of Denmark, Sweden, and Norway ruled until 1468. There is no Roman period here. So you have the Picts. There is the medieval period, sort of starts after the Vikings, a lot later than the rest of England. And we know they lived in longhouses. We find the remains, just little areas on the ground. And it's wonderful to go and see those and understand what you're looking at. But it's lovely that we can take all of them together and rebuild how we think a Viking longhouse looked. And it's great to experimental archaeology. It's great to sit and have your lunch in there, which counts as experimental archaeology because you're seeing how the space works socially. On Shetland, you can go to the furthest point of the British Isles. That's the name of the place. It means big rock, basically. It's the lighthouse at the furthest northernmost point of Britain. And beyond there is the Arctic. And if you turn a bit right, you will go to Norway. And there was a lady who went adrift from Shetland when the captain went overboard, and she pitched up in Norway. The currents took her there, and she arrived back having sort of nibbled on biscuits and a tiny amount of water for 2 days or so. And it was in the Victorian times, and she was quite a hero when she was brought home. Proves that even if you can't sail, you can get to Norway. Is getting back as easy, I wonder? But anyway, the connections are there. And we mentioned in the introduction, Jimmy Perez. Well, if people love to travel and they love to tell stories, the Vikings did. They told lots of sagas. We still tell stories now. It tends to be by TV and film and radio. And so when we visit the outside setting for Jimmy Perry's house, which is what this is, we all love to be there and just share those moments. And we're still doing what they did in the Neolithic time, in the Viking time. We're telling stories. And you would have travelled from Shetland to Orkney, still telling stories. The Orkney saga is a Viking story, an epic. And sure, we have bigger boats to go from one to the other, but the Vikings came to Orkney as well. They built St. Magnus Cathedral, glorious cathedral, built by the same masons we think has built Durham Cathedral. It has some of the same hallmarks, as it were. Built in the 1100s. It's a very heavily built. It's building using the same stones but shaped that is used in the Nessa Brodga, the same kind of stone, because you use what you've got. After the Vikings left, there were the Earls of Orkney, an old name that came from the Viking times, and it's a power struggle. And there's a couple of generations of them, about 1600, where lots of stories are told. They built palaces, they built castles, they clashed, they tried to... It's the only monumental buildings of the time. One of them was called Black Patty, Patrick Stewart, not of Star Trek, that just happens to be the same name. And he was such a bad, oppressive leader that he was eventually executed, but they had to delay his execution because he didn't know the Lord's Prayer and he had to learn it first. That's how bad he was at the time. But they are lovely castles and palaces to run around and see the halls and imagine the feasts. If you're into World Wars, you can go to Orkney and experience great stories there. As I say, stories are part of Orkney and Shetland. This is the Italian chapel, really lovely little building built by prisoners of war, Italian prisoners of war, who were set to working on a feature we'll see in a moment. And it's two Nissen huts, rounded Nissen huts, put together. They asked for a chapel and they were told, well, you can have these Nissen huts and you've got to make the decoration yourself. And the leader of all of this, Domenico Cecchetti, he happened to have a postcard that his mother had given him of the Madonna and Child. And he used that as the base for the painting on the wall. What a brilliant artist he was. They had to use corned beef tins, which they carved out to make the lantern that you see up on the right and the ones which are further back in the chapel. They used metal that they took from the block ships that were down on the shore, which will have their story in a moment. They used concrete instead of stone. They used everything they could salvage, and they made a beautiful work of art. And the family are still connected to the Orkney Islands. They are still, the daughter of the chap who was the leader of all of this is the president of the society for this chapel. There are close connections between the Italians and Orkney now. One of them got a bit closer, you might say. He actually fell in love with a local girl, even though he was married back at home. And we always say to people who go there, look for the little heart that's set into the stones. He left his heart behind in Orkney when he went home. Some lovely stories. But the reason that they were building here and working here is because these block ships, which have been sunk across the islands, a string of islands, and behind it is Scapa Flow, the biggest harbour, natural harbour, and the British fleet used to be there for safety and to be ready to stop the Germans from coming up over the top of Scotland and into the Atlantic, because the English Channel was obviously dangerous in the war. And so they put block ships to protect the ships, the fleet, from U-boats and attack. And this worked up to a point until in 1939, one commanded by Prien, he brought his submarine in, found there was only one ship in the harbour, the rest were on manoeuvres, and he torpedoed it. And it was a training ship, and many young boys went down with it. Massive loss of life. The bell was salvaged and put in the cathedral, and it has a book of remembrance. And they decided that this could never happen again. Churchill was First Lord of the Admiralty, and so the Churchill barriers were planned. These blocks of stone, which are not just thrown down like building blocks, they are carefully planned, carefully placed to allow the tides to move, but not submarines. And you're not allowed to use prisoners of war for military operations, so these were civil causeways to join the islands together, on paper at least. But clearly it was a submarine block. Lots of history. Amongst the history, you look down and there's the flowers. Now, these are just pretty, but of course, what grows on the ground decides what you can do, how you can live. Why do people go to Orkney and Shetland in the Neolithic? I'm frequently asked. And the answer is because there's good fishing. Shetlanders are fishermen who might have a bit of land, and the Orcadians are farmers who might have a boat. It's slightly reversed. Orkney is brilliant pasture land. Shetland is not such great pasture land, but good for fishing. And Orkney beef is fantastic. The bulls and the calves all stay with the cows. They are unstressed. The pasture land is good, and the beef tastes fantastic. The food is a good reason for being in Orkney. In the Neolithic, and even now as well, you can eat all sorts of lovely things, from the beer barley, which is an old barley, Neolithic barley, which is still grown today because it likes that environment. And you can get little beer bannocks, which are little beer barley bread, sort of cake type texture to it. Little specialities. You can get Highland Park, and you can get ice cream that's made with Highland Park as well, the whiskey that's on there. Food is always a good reason to visit islands. And of course, though, when you go to Orkney, and I try and go every year, I've gone to excavate, I've been going for years and years and years, and every time the atmosphere, the wide skies, the archaeology, the nature that's around as well, it's just full of stories that go back 5,000 years, but the stories continue. They continue on. They continue into the Iron Age and those brochs and the fascination of what was really going on then. We have the Vikings who will come in after the Picts have built some of their structures. And then we have the castles. It's not a huge area, and it's lots of different islands, but the archaeology and the story is all around, and the locals all know that they are part of that story that goes on, and they are very proud of their archaeology. And I don't think that any archaeologist who learns archaeology, who becomes a professional archaeology, if you're into prehistory, Orkney is on the wish list, because it's the place where you can really walk amongst the Neolithics, enter their homes, go to their ceremonial sites, enter their tombs. It's a fantastic place, and I hope you've enjoyed our talk this evening. Thank you.
Oh, Gillian, that was a really fantastic talk. Thank you so much. I think it has achieved what the Travel Tuesday lecture series has set out to do, which is that you've made me want to just get onto the next plane and head straight to Orkney and Shetland. but I need you as my guide because you just know your subject so well. You tell the stories in such an engaging way. So thank you so much, Gillian, for a really, really fabulous talk. Now, I'm sure there will be questions.
Can I start things off with, I've got something that leapt to mind. I'm absolutely fascinated, Gillian, with this idea of all the different types of structures in the Neolithic all being linked together. And because I have worked on this program with you, I know that the Skara Brae is only about 10 kilometres from the Ring of Brodgar, and the idea that they could walk there. But you said also that in the Neolithic, the sea level was lower and there was a lot more land. Has anybody done an underwater archaeology survey to find out what is missing, what more there is?
Yeah, there's quite near the Ness of Brodgar in the loch, they have found that there's probably another stone circle down on the shore or what we consider the shore down in the waters. It's really tricky. The waters aren't that clear. So it's a very difficult place to do underwater archaeology. And I love being an archaeologist, but nothing on earth would make me do underwater archaeology. It's a very specific thing. And it's very difficult because the currents would make life very hard to do it. There are occasionally projects which check certain areas. We do know that there will be archaeology, but if they were timber, they will have long gone. There must be stone ones, though. Skara Brae looks like it's on the shore, but actually the little lagoon was a sort of swampy little lagoon. We know that from coring down into the ground, and the sea would have been about where the pieces of land come round. So it wasn't so far out. It's not a huge way out. Let's just say there are projects in hand, but it's so easy to do the archaeology on the land. And the Ness of Brodgar has been going for 20 years as an archaeological site. And they've had to stop to do their post excavation to catch up in a way and make sense of what they've got. But they could have been doing it for another 100 years. And we know that that is fruitful and it produces goods. So sometimes it's better to focus on the places that you know will produce the results than it is to spend a vast amount doing underwater. I think soon they will be able to do, just as we scan the ground with ground penetrating radar, LiDAR will help. This thing where you can see down through the surfaces. And I think it's more a case of waiting for the technology to enable us to see what's under the water. And then we can target it. Because when I started archaeology, you used to stand there and go, that looks a promising spot to dig. And you dig it. And then ground penetrating radar and everything came along. And now we go zap, 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 zap. Oh, look, there's the place we need to dig. Saves you months of digging and missing the important bit by that much, which often happens. You dig a trench, go back 3 years later, and I kid you not, something is always 6 inches outside your original trench. So better to have targeted excavations. And I think the technology will catch up with us and enable us to do that. So look ahead and watch, the news, really.
Thanks, Gillian. I think, Anne, you have a question for Gillian.
Firstly, Gillian, just want to thank you because that was just fascinating, very enjoyable. I'm curious, with your own background, how did you get involved in this area of archaeology? Did you visit as a child or did you hear about it? What's led your association with this wonderful area?
Yeah, well, I suppose I was about 9 when I was read Tales of Greece and Rome when I was at primary school, and I discovered there was another world, another time, and people lived a different culture. They made these other stories up of heroes and monsters, and I was fascinated. I went on to do classics. I went on to do Latin and ancient history at university, which isn't the Neolithic. But everywhere I went, on holiday, I would drag my poor children round. We'd start a walk at archaeology, we'd end a walk at archaeology, and we'd visit something else on the way that was archaeology. And in Britain, there's a lot of Neolithic. And I started to be really fascinated. And when I was 11, we were told to do a project, and I chose a Ladybird book, The Stone Age Man in Britain. And it showed pictures of people just wearing loincloths of fur, putting up Stonehenge. And even at that age, I knew that's wrong. If you can do those stones, you can make clothes, And so I was intrigued, and I started to get more intrigued. And then I wanted to add something practical to my history, and I picked up a trowel. I joined a class which turned into a project, which ended up with me at the front lecturing about it. And the Neolithic has always been a pet area because you take away all the complexities of modern life. You have to decide how you live with your neighbours permanently all year, which is very different to nomadic groups. You have to have groups that come together because otherwise you don't get more human beings. You have to marry, etc., or whatever. You have to make do with what you've got. The ingenuity once I realized they were not primitive and they were just as clever as us, that's when the penny dropped. And then the Neolithic has just proven this time and time again. And it's just ripe for more exploration. It's quite philosophical. What do we do as human beings when you strip us of our resources and our technology? How do we manage and make what would be deemed a comfortable life, a worthwhile life, a community life? All of those questions. There is so much room for not just the imaginative school of archaeology, which is alive and well, but for understanding from tiny clues. So the Neolithic has a lot of scope still in it for really exploring what it is to be a human being. That's why I like the Neolithic.
Thank you, Gillian. Russell, I think you've got a question for Gillian.
Yeah, I just wondered, you jumped from the Neolithic to the Iron Age and skipped the Bronze Age, and you only very briefly mentioned it. Is that because there's not much evidence or nobody's explored that period in that area?
Thank you, Russell. The Neolithic came to quite a sudden stop. The Neolithic had a closing ceremony. 400 cattle were killed in one event. We know that from the analysis. So were they leaving the island? Well, why would you do that? Why would you kill virtually every cattle that you had and have a heck of a barbecue? What closed down everything was, we just don't know. We're trying to understand that. That's one of the questions. The Bronze Age is barely present on Orkney and Shetland, and it seems to flourish again now. Whether that's just because the archaeology hasn't surfaced. Absence of archaeology doesn't mean absence of the presence of people. It just means we haven't found it yet.
Mm-hmm.
The Neolithic is such a hub. We think it may even have been a hub for miles and miles and miles around, and even connected to Stonehenge. There may be connections, links. Certainly a ritual centre. And then suddenly that became old hat. So last year, the belief system changed when the Bronze Age people came in, the Beaker people came in, southern England. They had a totally different viewpoint, worldview, if you like. They had this metal bronze, which, imagine you've never seen bronze before, or any metal before. It is magical and different. Created an elite warrior society, didn't seem to match with what's in the Neolithic, but there's so little that's Bronze Age. There is some, but not much at all. It's almost like they were passing through. So this huge settled Neolithic culture that is such a, open a picture book and step inside level for Orkney. And then the Iron Age comes in with its brochs and its settlements around it, and is healthy and thriving. And to build those brochs takes a lot of community and a lot of organizing and a lot of leadership. So there is this gap, and it looks like they just didn't go to Orkney much for whatever reason. Was there a climate issue? We don't know, because peat formed in the Bronze Age, so we don't really know. But believe me, they're looking into it.
Yep.
Yeah, it's brilliant in England. Go to the Bronze Age sites; it's also over the place, but not in Orkney and Shetland. Yeah.
Well, initially, when we started, did you take the tops off those houses? Yeah, because I thought, God, it'd still be cold in there.
Yeah, obviously, human beings like to have a roof, and believe me, there is a wind. That's why there's no many trees in Orkney and Shetland.
Yes.
They have roofs, and it has been the archaeological debate. The early archaeologists just took out the rubbish to get to the floors and the walls, and they hadn't got analysis to find organic remains. So there was a lot of sweeping out. They also said, oh, they had really rubbish flagstones because when we walked on them, they cracked. And maybe they just didn't have shoes, which is back to that primitive concept.
Yes.
And it's like, don't be stupid. Of course you have shoes in Orkney, otherwise your feet would drop off with cold in winter. So
Yes.
what they suddenly realised was that these thin stones were the roof stones, like slate roofs. So they must have had a lot of driftwood that comes from Canada. We know that spruce, Canadian firs and the like do land on the Orkney, Shetland shores. And if people haven't lived there building things, there would have been, well, time eternity of currents. They would have been stacked up with driftwood at the beginning. So they would have used that to build their roofs, and then stone. But there's a lot of talk of grass and reeds and all of that. They would have made them waterproof, believe me. Everything would have been used, but because it was organic, it's rotted away, gone. But they would all have had roofs. We don't know if they had chimney spaces at all above the hearths, but we do know that in Iron Age roundhouses, the smoke sits about 7 feet up. And so it fumigates the thatch, or whatever they've made the roof with, and you can hang meats and things and smoke them to preserve them. And this is all experimental archaeology.
Okay.
Now, you would have conjunctivitis from having a fire in an enclosed space. That's a problem in societies today in similar houses. So that is a problem, but something you'd learn to manage. But do you have a chimney or not? They tried baking a chimney in a roundhouse in the Iron Age, in Castle Hendless, actually. The chap insisted, made it. And in the morning, there's this wonderful photograph of a charred remains of the house. Because what does a chimney do? It draws the flames. And the whole thing burnt down overnight. Good.
Gillian, there's also been a question about what book you would recommend for learning more about this this part of the world and its archaeology.
Yeah, when you come on a tour, you get a reading list. Obviously, I have to say my book, Visiting the Past, because the Neolithic part, a lot of Neolithic evidence comes from Orkney and Shetland. But there's Caroline Wickham Jones, has sadly passed away prematurely. She was Mrs. Orkney, basically, and she wrote a historical guide to Orkney. And it is not a reading book as such. It is looking up places and the like. Just go on Amazon and put Orkney archaeology, and you will get all sorts. But also, there's it used to be called Orkney Yar. Go to the Ness of Brodgar website. So Ness, Ness of Brodgar, Brodgar, and it's all about the excavation. But it also has a bit that says about the Ness. Now that means partly about the Ness site, but it also means around and about. And you can go on that and you can look at the different sites that are in Orkney. And Sigurd, who is the sort of deputy for the big site at the Ness of Brodgar, has written this. And it is the latest information. He's there at the sharp end of the trowel. And it's a really good resource. So the Ness of Brodgar website, and find the bit that you can see about other sites. And that, it's a wonderful, wonderful overview. You can choose which bit you're looking at. You can ask it, there's all sorts of articles, blogs. He's done a fantastic, truly fantastic job of it. And that is where I would point people, the Ness of Brodgar website. Yeah.
Gillian, thank you. It's very interesting. I wish I was going, but I can't make it with all the walking now. Two things. Would all those animals being destroyed be the results of disease, either human or bovine? And to miss the Bronze Age, would it be because they didn't have both all the minerals to use? And iron would have been easier?
Yeah, to start with that one, yes, there's no copper. There would be no attraction to going up there if you need to make bronze. It's one of the reasons why the Mediterranean, the Eastern Mediterranean, is the buzzing home of the Bronze Age. But actually, it's possibly slightly easier to do the Mediterranean to Cornwall than it is from Orkney to Cornwall, ironically. Yes. We don't know, and we do think there might have been disease for the people, but you wouldn't eat diseased animals, and these animals have been butchered and eaten almost certainly. We don't actually know. I don't know whether anyone's done a pathology on the bones to see if there is with the cattle were laid out around these houses. They were ceremoniously laid out, the heads and the long bones. So they've been butchered. It could just be this is what we do. you know, tradition and all of that. Something about bulls' heads is very, very prominent. I mean, bulls are big creatures, you know, they're your
Yes.
cattle, they're your wealth, but they're also powerful. And every prehistoric society that has bulls treats them as a symbol of power. So is it connected with that? We are still working on it. And I think the Nessa Brodka may come up with answers while they're doing their years of post-excavation work. They may be analysing and finding out more.
Well, it's very clear that archaeology is an ongoing voyage of discovery with all sorts of interesting things yet to be found, as well as uncovering some of the treasures and the secrets of the past. And I think that really is what Gillian has done for us all this evening, taken us into past ages. She's shown us how people have lived. She really has given us a fabulous presentation of a wonderful part of the world. I'd like to not only thank Gillian, but also thank the team at ASA, and join us next month for Travel Tuesday. Thanks, everyone. Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Gillian. Bye-bye.